Control is often mistaken for strength because it looks like stability. It produces clean edges. It reduces motion. It makes the interior feel less exposed. But stability is not the same as integrity. Integrity survives pressure because it is built to move with it. Control survives pressure by narrowing movement until pressure becomes harder to detect. It does not remove strain. It changes the way strain is distributed. It turns dynamic weight into static weight and calls the result order. This is why control appears most convincing at the moment it becomes most necessary. The first signs of inner instability are rarely spectacular. They are subtle losses of tolerance. Attention becomes less elastic. Contradictions become louder. Minor unpredictability begins to feel like structural threat. The mind starts treating variation as damage, not as normal movement. Because the system no longer trusts its own flexibility, it begins to add reinforcement. Control is reinforcement under stress. It is not initially a worldview. It is a compensatory response to load. It begins as a narrowing, not because narrowing is desirable, but because narrowing is easier to maintain than coherence. Coherence requires coordination among multiple forces. Narrowing requires only reduction. When the interior can no longer hold several pressures at once, memory, desire, obligation, uncertainty, control reduces the number of pressures that are allowed to register. It does this by selecting what counts as real, what counts as relevant, what counts as permitted. The selection is experienced as clarity. Clarity is not always perception. Sometimes it is compression. A stable interior does not need to patrol itself. It can afford gaps. It can tolerate unfinished meaning. It can withstand a degree of noise without interpreting it as collapse. Control is the opposite condition. It treats gaps as breaches. It treats unfinished meaning as unacceptable exposure. It begins to seal openings. At first, this feels like strength. The mind becomes efficient. It makes faster decisions. It eliminates hesitation. It reduces internal debate. But the efficiency is achieved by removing load-bearing nuance. Under compression, the mind learns to prefer simple supports because complex supports require adjustment, and adjustment requires tolerance. Control produces a kind of smoothness. It also produces brittleness. A regime forms when reinforcement becomes policy. The earliest stage is reactive. The mind encounters strain and tightens. It encounters ambiguity and clamps down. It encounters emotional variability and tries to neutralize it. The response is not moral. It is mechanical. It is the movement of a structure attempting to preserve itself without redesigning itself. Over time, what began as a response becomes a standard. Tightening becomes the default posture. The mind stops asking whether the load has changed and starts behaving as if load is constant. This is how an internal regime emerges, not by decision, but by repetition of a compensatory posture until it becomes the shape of the system. The regime does not announce itself. It becomes obvious only when it fails. Control is not a single act. It is the gradual replacement of adaptive capacity with rigid supports. The mind does this because rigid supports are reliable in the short term. They do not require negotiation. They do not require integration. They can be applied quickly. They can be enforced locally. They create immediate relief by reducing movement. The cost is transferred elsewhere. When a structure cannot flex, the stress does not disappear. It migrates. It accumulates at joints. It finds weak points. It concentrates in places that were not built to hold it. Control often feels like calm because it shifts strain away from conscious awareness and toward less visible thresholds. This is why control can coexist with exhaustion. The interior appears ordered, yet the system is spending enormous energy on holding the order in place. The calm is maintained by constant bracing. The bracing becomes continuous background labor. It is not experienced as effort at first. It is experienced as normal. The regime's first achievement is predictability. Predictability is not truth. It is the reduction of variables. The mind begins to prefer predictable suffering over unpredictable possibility because predictable suffering can be reinforced against. Unpredictable possibility demands flexibility. As the regime consolidates, it begins to standardize. It builds internal rules that are not explicitly formulated, but operate with the force of law. What is allowed to be felt? What is allowed to be wanted? What is allowed to be remembered? What is allowed to be imagined? These are not ethical choices. They are load management choices. The mind is trying to prevent certain forces from entering the system because it cannot trust itself to hold them without destabilization. The most important feature of an internal regime is not harshness, it is surveillance. Surveillance is how reinforcement becomes continuous. The mind monitors itself for deviation. It measures internal movement against an implicit standard of acceptable strain. Anything that exceeds that standard is treated as threat. Threat triggers tightening. Tightening reduces deviation. Reduction produces temporary relief. Relief confirms the system. The cycle becomes self-validating. At this stage, control begins to mistake its own pressure for stability. The mind assumes the strain it feels is evidence that strain is everywhere. It no longer remembers what low strain felt like. It only remembers the absence of acute failure. This is a crucial shift. The regime stops being a response to pressure and becomes a producer of pressure. Because continuous bracing increases internal load, it creates friction. It introduces resistance to natural movement. It forces the system to spend energy on containment rather than on function. This means the same life conditions now generate more strain than they once did. Not because life has become heavier, but because the interior has become less capable of distributing weight. Control creates a paradox. The more it reinforces, the less it can tolerate. The less it can tolerate, the more it reinforces. A second orientation arrives here. The regime is not built to eliminate instability. It is built to make instability legible. It reduces the interior into a set of measurable signals: safe, unsafe, permitted, forbidden, stable, unstable. Complexity becomes suspicious because complexity cannot be monitored continuously. The regime therefore converts complexity into categories. Categorization is a reinforcement technique. It allows fast deployment of response. It also turns nuanced forces into rigid blocks. Once a force has been categorized, it is handled according to policy rather than according to context. The system no longer meets reality as it is. It meets reality as a set of anticipated loads. This is how control begins to reshape perception, not by delusion, but by filtration. The mind does not fabricate a new world. It reduces the existing world until only the manageable parts remain. Manageability becomes a substitute for reality. The regime's strength depends on avoidance of redesign. Redesign would require admitting that the current distribution of load is failing. That admission would itself increase strain. It would imply that previous reinforcement was insufficient. It would produce uncertainty about what to do next. The regime cannot afford that uncertainty, so it doubles down on reinforcement. Doubling down is experienced as discipline. It is actually a refusal to rebuild. Every internal regime has protected zones, areas of thought that cannot be touched without threatening collapse, memories that cannot be re-entered, desires that cannot be acknowledged, questions that cannot be allowed to form. The system identifies these zones early, not through insight, but through the surge of strain that occurs whenever the mind approaches them. Because strain is interpreted as danger, the regime marks these zones as off-limits. Avoidance becomes structural. The mind does not merely avoid content, it avoids the internal pathways that lead toward it. This creates hollow corridors inside the self, regions that exist only as absence, only as vibration, only as negative space. The regime keeps these corridors sealed because opening them would release unpredictable load into the system. The cost is that the sealed corridors continue to hold pressure. Sealing does not neutralize, it contains. Containment requires constant maintenance. Maintenance requires vigilance. Vigilance keeps the system tense. Tension reduces flexibility. Reduced flexibility increases strain. The corridor becomes more pressurized over time, not less. Control, therefore, generates the very force it is trying to prevent. When the regime cannot redesign, it compensates by adding layers. It reinforces over existing reinforcement. It builds redundant supports. It creates extra checks. It introduces internal procedures. These procedures can look like precision. They are actually additional mass. Additional mass increases load. The mind begins to feel heavy. At this stage, control often becomes moralized after the fact. The system starts to justify its internal laws. It begins to claim that what is forbidden because it is wrong, not because it is too heavy to hold. This moralization is not ethical maturity. It is structural rationalization. The regime needs reasons that feel stable. It cannot admit that its rules are compensation. So it produces narratives that portray compensation as virtue. This is how control acquires dignity. It calls itself responsibility. It calls itself principle. It calls itself clarity. It does this because a regime cannot survive if it is experienced as merely afraid. It needs legitimacy. Legitimacy reduces internal debate. Reduced debate reduces movement. Reduced movement reduces immediate strain. Legitimacy is another reinforcement technique. A third orientation emerges. The regime is not primarily concerned with what is true. It is concerned with what can be held without tremor. It selects truth as a load-bearing material. It chooses conclusions that stabilize. It rejects conclusions that destabilize. Even when destabilizing conclusions are accurate, they are treated as hostile because accuracy is not the governing criterion. This does not make the regime irrational. It makes it structurally consistent. It is optimizing for continuity under stress. It is building a survivable interior at the cost of adaptive capacity. The most visible symptom is rigidity of interpretation. Events are read through fixed frames. Relationships are read through fixed assumptions. The future is read as repetition. Surprise becomes personal violation. Uncertainty becomes intolerable. The regime is trying to avoid the one thing it cannot reinforce against: the need to change the structure itself. Change is not avoided because it is difficult. It is avoided because it threatens the hidden compromises that keep the system standing. Control depends on hidden compromises because reinforcement is often added in haste. It is not integrated into the whole design. It is attached where strain is felt. It is local, not systemic. This means the interior can become a patchwork of supports that do not align. The system can hold only if these misalignments remain untested. Testing would reveal inconsistency. Inconsistency would produce load shifts. Load shifts would expose weakness. So the regime avoids tests. It prefers routines. It prefers environments that do not demand redesign. It prefers predictable interactions. It prefers repetitive tasks. Not because repetition is inherently good, but because repetition keeps load patterns familiar. Familiar load patterns allow reinforcement to remain unchanged. The regime does not seek comfort. It seeks stable load patterns. This is why control can become attached to tension. Tension is predictable. Relaxation introduces movement. Movement introduces uncertainty. Uncertainty introduces strain. The regime chooses the strain it can anticipate over the strain it cannot. The internal regime also begins to treat spontaneity as structural risk. Spontaneity opens unmonitored pathways. It allows forces to enter that have not been categorized. It disrupts the surveillance function. The mind responds by tightening further. It begins to preempt itself. It predicts deviation before deviation occurs. It blocks impulses at the moment of formation. This is how control moves, from managing behavior to managing emergence. The mind becomes less of a space where forces interact and more of a checkpoint where forces must prove legitimacy before they can exist. Many forces cannot prove legitimacy because legitimacy is defined by the regime. The regime defines legitimacy in terms of low strain. Anything that produces strain is deemed illegitimate. This is not prudence. It is a closed system. As emergence is suppressed, vitality is not destroyed, but it is displaced. It moves into subtler forms. It appears as restlessness. It appears as irritability. It appears as compulsive micro-adjustment. The system keeps trying to redistribute energy that has no allowed outlet. The regime interprets this restlessness as further evidence that control must increase. It does not recognize restlessness as trapped movement. It recognizes it as instability. So it reinforces against it. The reinforcement increases trapped movement. The system becomes noisy, then insists on silence. Eventually, control reaches a saturation point. The interior has so many supports that ordinary life becomes difficult to carry. Simple contact produces excessive strain. Minor conflict triggers disproportionate tightening. The mind becomes reactive not because it is weak, but because it is overbuilt. Too many supports means too many points where stress can concentrate. Too many rules means too many opportunities for breach. Too much monitoring means too much signal. Surveillance creates signal overload. When signal overload occurs, the regime begins to fail in a particular way. It does not collapse all at once. It fractures in localized zones. Small failures occur: lapses, outbursts, detachment, numbness, sudden impulsivity, sudden fatigue. These failures are treated as moral weakness or personal defect because the regime cannot interpret them as structural. It cannot admit that reinforcement has created fragility. So it responds with more reinforcement. It responds by tightening the rules. It responds by intensifying surveillance. It responds by reducing tolerance further. This accelerates failure. Failure cascades do not begin with catastrophe. They begin with misinterpretation. The regime is built to interpret strain as threat. But when strain is produced by reinforcement itself, the regime begins to fight its own supports. It tightens to stop the tension caused by tightening. It braces to stop the tremor caused by bracing. It tries to silence the noise caused by surveillance. The system becomes internally adversarial, not because it hates itself in a sentimental sense, but because its governing logic can no longer distinguish between external load and self-generated load. At this point, control can feel like being held together by force. The interior remains standing, but only by constant pressure. There is no margin, there is no slack. Slack would be perceived as collapse. So the system maintains a state of continuous near failure. The mind becomes a structure that is always one shift away from rupture. This is why control often produces a strange kind of confidence. Confidence is not always belief in capacity. Sometimes it is the certainty that tightening will occur. The regime trusts its own enforcement. It trusts its own ability to clamp down. It trusts that any breach will be punished quickly. That trust creates a sense of order. It also guarantees that the interior remains tense. A fourth orientation arrives in the late stage. The regime does not need external disorder to feel threatened. It generates threat internally because threat is the condition under which it knows how to function. If pressure disappeared, the system would not know what to do with openness. Openness would feel like exposure. Exposure would trigger tightening. Tightening would recreate pressure. Pressure would restore familiarity. The regime becomes self-sustaining. There is no villain inside this. There is no singular moment where control is chosen. There is only an accumulation of reinforcements added to survive strain until survival becomes the entire design. The mind becomes a space optimized for not breaking, rather than for living. The tragedy is not that control exists. Control is often necessary in moments. The tragedy is that control becomes the only available method for distributing load. When that happens, every experience is processed through the same response: brace, narrow, seal, monitor. This response can hold a structure together for a long time. It can also make the structure increasingly uninhabitable. In the residue, what remains is not a lesson, it is a condition. An inner regime does not end when it is recognized. Recognition is not redesign. Recognition can become another form of surveillance. The regime can incorporate recognition as a new checkpoint, a new rule, a new standard of acceptable awareness. It can tighten around insight the way it tightens around fear. The system remains standing. The supports remain in place. The pressure continues to circulate because the underlying problem was never a lack of control. It was a distribution of load that could not be held without compression. The interior, therefore, settles into a peculiar stability. Not the stability of a structure at rest, but the stability of constant bracing. Nothing collapses. Nothing resolves. The regime persists because it is functional. It persists because it works. It persists because the cost of loosening a single support still feels higher than the cost of living under strain. Control becomes the material the mind trusts most. And a material trusted too much becomes the only material used. What remains is reinforcement that cannot be removed without risking sudden redistribution, and pressure that cannot be released without revealing how much pressure has been held.